Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer.
And I'm Krista Carmen.
And this is
Murder Coaster.
Step right up, ladies and gentlemen, and hear the strangest of tales. A story of fate, coincidence, and murder. Of two men with the same names and parallel lives, like a gothic tale of doppelgangers, but a story that transcends the bizarre and true crime to make a statement about justice and society, bureaucracy, and our very understanding of the human mind, the mysteries of the brain itself. Today, we bring you a tale as fascinating and poignant as it is bizarre and mysterious. The curious case of the two Dr. Gilmers.
Let's begin. Prologue. The first Dr. Gilmer. On June 28, 2004, Dr. Vincent Gilmer left Cane Creek Family Health Center, the small rural clinic he'd founded with his wife in the tiny town of Fletcher, outside of Asheville, North Carolina, driving his brand new Toyota Tacoma pickup truck into the Appalachian Mountains.
Dr. Gilmer, often called Bear by his beloved patients, both for his large size and proclivity for warm, heartfelt hugs, drove out to the Brofton Hospital, a psychiatric facility in Morgantown, North Carolina, to pick up his 60-year-old father, who'd fallen into dementia.
In order to better care for his ailing father, Dr. Gilmer had recently arranged for his father to be admitted to a new facility called Fletcher's Fairview Health and Retirement Center, which was just a few minutes' drive from his home, making it easier for visits.
Bringing along a canoe to get his father, the doctor told his staff he was going to take the old man out for a trip on the Watauga Lake in Tennessee.
Dr. Gilmer was a big believer in the healing power of nature and had been known to take depressed patients out on hikes rather than give them medication. So no one thought it odd at the time that the doctor would bring his wheelchair-bound elderly father, who couldn't walk and was so deep in dementia he didn't know where he was and could barely speak, 2 hours in the wrong direction and onto a lake for a nighttime canoe trip.
Dr. Gilmer checked his father out of the hospital. Then the two stopped at an Arby's for dinner. Dr. Gilmer's father humming, "Ba, ba, black sheep." They drove out on winding two-lane country roads across the heart of Appalachia, through fog-filled hollers, into Cherokee National Forest, and over the Tennessee border. Past Watauga Lake, the immense sky now fully black with night and glimmering with countless stars. The Blue Ridge Mountains draped in moonlight.
The kindly beloved doctor then pulled to the side of the road, took a dog leash, wrapped it around his father's neck, and pulled the ends tight, strangling the life from the elderly man. Once he was sure his father was dead, Dr. Vincent Gilmer then cut off his father's fingers with a pair of gardening shears and dumped the corpse into a ditch on the side of the road, and drove back home to North Carolina.
Chapter 1. The Other Dr. Gilmer. Following the murder of his father, Dr. Vincent Gilmer was arrested, put on trial, found guilty, and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
With its founder in prison, the Cane Creek Family Medical Center closed. But 3 years later, it was reopened, and the rural clinic was now in need of a new doctor. They found the perfect candidate, a caring and kind family man with a wife and young daughter, another child on the way, who'd recently moved to the area and had a passion for family medicine. There was only one issue. This new candidate had the same last name as the former doctor. Though they weren't related in any way, he too was Dr. Gilmer, only he was Dr. Benjamin Gilmer.
At the job interview, a bevy of doctors and healthcare officials interviewed Dr. Benjamin Gilmer, all impressed by his credentials and enthusiasm, but skeptical of his name. One of them asking him, "Do you know why this clinic was closed?"
Broadly, yes, but I really don't know the details.
"Do you know that you and the previous doctor there have the same last name?"
Listen, I get it. We're both named Gilmer. That might be odd for patients at first, but the truth is, it's just a coincidence. I don't think my name will affect the way they treat me, or if it does, it won't for very long.
But the group looked unconvinced, wary, telling him they'd let him know in a few days.
Dr. Gilmer walked out to the parking lot, thinking he wouldn't get the job. But as he went to get into his car, a member of the board came jogging out and saying, "Congratulations, you got the job," handing him the keys to the building.
Dr. Gilmer was ecstatic, celebrating the new job with his wife, and set to work ingratiating himself with the staff and patients.
Unlike his predecessor, who was from the rural enclave, the new Dr. Gilmer knew he'd be seen as an outsider, someone from, quote, over the hill, end quote, seen as a liberal and a hippie, and was determined to make his patients trust him by being as kind and caring as possible.
When the first patient came in, the receptionist said, "Well, this will be the perfect introduction. Just don't call him William. He hates that."
"Well, what do I call him?" Dr. Gilmer asked.
"Call him Mule Man.
Mule Man?
He's the only guy on the mountain who still plows his land by hand using mules."
In came a beanpole-thin old man wearing an old flannel shirt and a battered pair of Carhartt overalls, saying,
"Got a cough. Just stick me with some penicillin, Doc, and I'll be on my way."
"Well, let's examine you first."
"It's what the vet gave me when I was a boy. If it was good enough for them horses, it was good enough for me."
"A veterinarian gave you penicillin as a child?"
"Son, I grew up in Yancey County. Weren't no doctors there."
As the doctor examined the remarkably healthy old farmer, he tried a bit of humor, saying, "Did you ride your mule here today?"
The farmer's face darkened and he scowled. "Son, you don't ride mules. Them animals are for working. Don't you know nothing?"
After the examination, Mule Man handed Dr. Gilmer a mason jar filled with glimmering green goo, tiny seeds and flecks of red floating in it, saying,
"Here, for your troubles."
"What is this?"
"Chow chow."
Chow chow, by the way, is pickled relish, for those who don't know.
And I have never heard of it before. Have you? Do you ever hear of chow chow?
I've never heard it called that, but I've certainly seen pickled relish.
Well, I know relish, but I guess it's like some kind of southern thing. I Googled it and shit. I'm like, what the fuck is this?
I mean,
Yeah.
the red flecks, I feel like I've seen it. I wonder if what I'm thinking of is the same as chow chow, let's put it that way. I wonder if
I'm
it's
just thinking
like,
the shit you put on your hot dog, right?
yeah,
But
yeah.
they probably do something cool. I mean, it sounds good.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, everything went more or less as expected on Dr. Gilmer's first day at the clinic. That is, until the last patient of the day, a woman in her 60s who was there for back pain.
When Dr. Gilmer opened the door to see her, she was in a complete panic attack, hyperventilating and trembling, thinking that the original Dr. Gilmer was back and coming through the door, terrified to see the notorious murderer.
Dr. Benjamin Gilmer calmed her down, had her relax, then, as he was examining her, asked her about his predecessor And though she'd had a panic attack about the thought of seeing the former doctor, she gave him the answer most patients would, saying,
"Oh, I loved him. He was so nice to me. Used to drive out to my house when I couldn't get a ride out here. But that was before everything happened."
In fact, all of the former patients professed a great love for the murderer. Dr. Benjamin Gilmer was intrigued. Patients spoke of a kind and caring, generous man. As Benjamin says,
"I thought I was following an axe murderer, but that was not the story that was being told by my patients."
Former patient Ruth Tracy said when she lost her job and had no insurance, she told Dr. Vincent Gilmer to not run tests on her, as she couldn't afford them. But Vince insisted and did all the tests for free. He didn't even charge her for the visit. And when she needed medication, he was able to supply her with free samples.
Ruth described a selfless and devoted family doctor that listened to her, gave her hugs.
When she asked him how he could treat her without taking money, he simply said,
"We have to help each other out."
Another patient who suffered from depression told how Dr. Vince had led her right out of the exam room and onto a 30-minute nature walk, searching a field for four-leaf clovers, saying,
"He really listened to me. I didn't expect that from a doctor. I expected he would just start me on an antidepressant like most doctors do. But then I was crawling around in the grass looking for the luck of the Irish, and you know what? I did feel better. Thought it was a little crazy, but it helped."
A construction worker told how Dr. Vince actually changed the family health center's hours of operation to accommodate his work schedule, now opening at 7 in the morning so that blue-collar folks could come in and not miss a day's work.
Many patients told anecdotes like this. He loaned them money, would take a bushel of corn as payment, gave free annual checkups to the local firefighters, even made house calls, and often wouldn't even charge for them. He sponsored the local middle school baseball team and would do free sports physicals for the children.
Dr. Vincent Gilmer had been so devoted to the families of the rural health center his wife and he had founded that he didn't even pay himself for the first 2 years of operations.
Slowly, spookily, Dr. Benjamin Gilmer began to relate to Dr. Vincent Gilmer, saw himself as a continuation of him. They had the same name, worked at the same clinic, the same specialty. Dr. Benjamin Gilmer was even the same age that Dr. Vincent Gilmer had been when he'd started working at the clinic.
Many patients couldn't even believe that Dr. Vince Gilmer committed the murder. They didn't see how the kindly doctor could hurt or kill anyone. He was so loving and kind. Some wondered if it was because his father had Alzheimer's, and maybe it was a mercy killing. It was the only thing that made any sense.
Dr. Benjamin Gilmer became very, very curious about the killing, developing possible theories. It was so bizarre. The former doctor claimed he committed the murder during a psychotic break brought on by having recently stopped the serotonin reuptake inhibitor drug Lexapro and having gone into SSRI withdrawal. He'd acted crazy at the trial, fired his lawyers, and defended himself, attempting to make himself an expert witness. The prosecution countered he was cold-blooded and pretending to be crazy.
One day, Dr. Benjamin Gilmer walked into his exam room to see a wizened old man with a crooked, eerie smile, grinning at him mischievously with wild, watery eyes. The old man said, "The other Dr. Gilmer knows about you."
Vince was startled, taken aback. "Excuse me," he said.
"The other Dr. Gilmer. You know, Vince Gilmer, the one in prison. You look like him, you know."
"I do?"
Oh, sure. And he knows who you are, too. I bet he's not real happy about you taking over his life.
For the first time since coming to the clinic, fear ran like ice through Dr. Gilmer's veins. His heart pounded as he asked the old man, How do you know?
He's getting out. And when he does, he's going to want to take back what's his.
How do you know he's getting out?
I heard it from a friend last week. I'd think about changing the locks if I were you.
The thought struck him like a cast iron skillet to the head. He'd taken over this guy's life. It was his clinic. He had literally built it. He wondered if Dr. Vincent Gilmer might be harboring some grudge in prison, might want to hurt him.
The thought stayed with Benjamin long after the old man had left. He began to have nightmares about the other Dr. Gilmer, his murderous doppelganger, coming to get him.
Then he was told that Vincent was out on parole, and he panicked, scanning the building when he arrived, on edge. It was just a rumor. The doctor hadn't been paroled at all. He was serving life without the chance of parole.
As a medical assistant says,
For a week, we're in panic mode, thinking he was going to show up here. Dr. Gilmer telling me that he was having nightmares and stuff.
paranoia began to reign. Bought surveillance cameras for his home, studying up on guns and self-defense. It became too much, and Dr. Benjamin Gilmer decided he needed to learn more. As he said,
You know, it's kind of like living with a ghost in your house. And you tell your kids it's a friendly ghost, but you never know where the ghost is coming from. So I'm planning to spend my professional life in that building. It's not going to go away. And until I know more, I'm not going to be able to let it go.
he read stacks of newspapers, pestered anyone and everyone who knew Dr. Vince for more information about him, meeting old friends of the former doctor at the farmer's market, whom Vince had loaned money to so they could start a jelly business.
He discovered that before the murder, Vincent had a very bad car accident, hitting a light pole, his car flipping off an exit ramp. At the hospital, he kept saying his name was Bobby Brown. When his wife arrived, he didn't know who she was, didn't know he was married.
That is crazy. Full amnesia. But his memory slowly returned a few days later, and rumors abounded that the doctor had crashed his truck on purpose to skip upcoming medical board exams, or even possibly as a suicide attempt. But those who are close to him say this is ridiculous and that it was definitely just an accident.
But the doctor was completely changed after the accident, like a different person. He left his wife completely unexpectedly, which shocked his family and friends.
As Terry Worley, an office manager at the Cane Creek Clinic, said,
Just out of the blue, he said him and Karen were getting a divorce. Nobody had a clue that they were even having problems. It was like a light switch. I thought it was a midlife crisis. You know, sometimes men go through a midlife crisis and they go out and buy a car, or go out and have an affair or something. We figured it would just blow over. And then that's when he went out and started drinking. And we saw a side of him we had not seen before.
Vincent began to drink heavily, hanging out at the bars in downtown Asheville, particularly Jack of the Wood. Even though he was deeply in debt, he splurged and bought himself a brand new pickup truck. Very unlike him. He was picking up women in the bars, taking them home, and he became obsessed with pornography.
Then on Monday, June 28th, 2004, Vincent closed the clinic early to go pick up his father, Dalton Gilmer, from the Broughton Hospital. In yet another bizarre chance, Dr. Benjamin had actually been doing clinical rotation at the hospital at the time. He tried to remember if he'd met the old man, but couldn't place him. Paperwork showed Vincent's father suffered both auditory and visual hallucinations, leading them to diagnose him with schizophrenia as well as dementia.
Why would Vince want to take his father canoeing? It made absolutely no sense. And afterwards, he claims his father just wandered off while they were playing catch with a frisbee. Playing catch? His father was in a wheelchair, suffering crippling dementia. None of it made any sense. And why report him missing? Why say he wandered off when it was well known he couldn't even walk?
All of it is so strange. Strangled with a dog leash, the fingers chopped off. There was blood in the bed of the truck. Why chop off his fingers? Did he bring the gardening shears along planning to do that?
It was spooky. And the more he researched the case, the more fear began to grip him. He began looking into buying a gun, surfing the internet late at night, bouncing from articles that read, "Area doctor murders father," to the Smith & Wesson website, looking for a pistol he could keep beside his bed.
He borrowed his brother's rifle, bought bear mace. His wife said to him,
"You're like a different person."
How? How am I different?
"You're not here, Benjamin. You aren't present. You're not the person I married."
I'm the same.
"The man I married doesn't bookmark gun websites. You need to do something about this. You cannot live like this. We cannot live like this."
But still, Dr. Benjamin could not stop researching. Now he was studying the effects of SSRI withdrawal. And there was, in fact, compelling evidence and a long list of examples. People who'd had violent psychotic breaks. Vincent claimed he was in SSRI withdrawal from coming off of Lexapro. He'd say,
"I have serotonin brain. It's like jellyfish electric stings in my head."
As a neurobiologist, Benjamin knew that SSRIs, like Lexapro, alter a person's brain chemistry. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter that helps to regulate functions such as sleep, vision, and pain, and happiness and well-being. Prozac, released in 1986, was one of the first of the serotonin reuptake inhibitor drugs, or SSRIs. They were not meant for long-term use, though that's the way they have become.
Benjamin began to wonder if there was a medical reason to explain the crime. He found bizarre quotes from Dr. Vince, like, "There's a man of war in my skull."
And the bizarre trial where he tried to become his own expert witness and been denied by the judge. The prosecution saying he was faking ailments of mental illness as he stammered.
It was a spiraling vortex of a rabbit hole with brain chemistry, crime and punishment, American justice. And when you have a vortex like that, you know that NPR is coming.
Chapter 2. This American Life. In the spring of 2011, Dr. Benjamin was contacted by Sarah Koenig from NPR about doing a segment on the show This American Life. Just a quick couple-minute act on a show about coincidences. Benjamin was not interested.
But then Benjamin began to think an investigative journalist might be just what he needed to solve this mystery. So he called Sarah back and told her,
"The ghost of Vince Gilmer isn't leaving Cane Creek, and if I'm ever going to find peace, I need to know as much as I can about him. I need your help."
And if the name Sarah Koenig sounds familiar, that's because she went on to do the Serial podcast, one of the biggest true crime podcasts that's ever existed. And I have to say this, This American Life is one of my all-time favorite shows. Ira Glass is more than a personal hero for me. He's like a literal god to me. And you know, I'd like to consider Murder Coaster to be the This American Life of true crime. Though, I think we end up being more like the John Waters of true crime. But
happy to have our listeners weigh in on that. See what they say. So Sarah showed up in North Carolina with her microphone and her investigative skills and set to interviewing folks and sussing out the story, having Benjamin introduce her to all of the former Dr. Gilmer's patients, friends, and relatives.
They talked with Vince's mother, Gloria. She said that Vince's father, Dalton, had come back from the Vietnam War, changed, suffering from extreme PTSD. He would be irrationally violent, incredibly abusive. There had been points where Dalton had drugged and tortured Gloria, taking photographs of it and even filming it. Gloria was hospitalized multiple times, spent time in battered women's shelters, and eventually divorced him and remarried.
They discovered Vince's father had been living in Alabama, gotten strung out on drugs, and had been homeless for a while. Then started going into dementia. Vince's uncle had simply put him on a bus and sent him to North Carolina for Vince to deal with.
And in North Carolina, Dalton had wandered off, refused to take medication, said that his son Vince was in the mafia and was trying to kill him. Dalton was only in his mid-60s at the time, not that old, but he was displaying signs of advanced dementia, and he was diagnosed with a type of late-set schizophrenia. Then Vince put him in the Broughton Hospital.
Soon afterwards, Vince's life began to fall apart. He had his accident, left his wife, bought a new truck. Meanwhile, the bill for his father's stay at Broughton was going through the roof. He owed $200,000. And he'd been receiving his father's Social Security checks, but hadn't been paying the bills. Or so it appeared.
When Vince was called by police to tell him his father's body had been found and that he'd been murdered, he was actually in a restaurant. He'd taken the entire staff of the clinic out for lunch, and he laid down and curled up on the bench like a little boy. He was telling friends,
I just can't form words in my mind. My brain is just slow.
Lead detective Michael Martin interviewed Vince the night after the body was found. Vince told him that he'd picked his father up at Broughton. They'd gone home and played a game of frisbee in the yard, and then Dalton had just wandered off, which made no sense. Vince was suspicious, weird. He was off in some weird way.
The detective said he quickly suspected Vince was the killer, for a simple reason. He didn't ask any questions. He didn't say, where was he found? When can I see him? What happened to him? To the detective, this made Vince not only seem guilty, but a cold-blooded killer who'd planned the murder.
Vince was then named as a person of interest in the murder.
And when Vince discovered that he was the lead suspect and wanted, he made some kind of crazy run for it. He grabbed a backpack and headed to the clinic to get more Lexapro and Ambien, which he says he needed to maintain any kind of touch with reality. But when he got near the clinic, he saw it was swarming with cops. So he hit the forest and hiked 7 miles out to a house that was for sale, where he hid under a deck in the dirt for a couple of days.
He then went to town and got a motel room, now completely out of the Lexapro and Ambien he'd been taking, saying being off the medication made him go into a weird, almost netherworld of psychosis. And he then went to the mall, desperately seeking more of the SSRI drugs, where he was recognized.
He darted to a payphone and contacted a woman he'd been seeing, who turned him in. And he ended up running through the woods with a canine team on his trail. And when the dogs caught up with him, he just lay down and let them bite the shit out of him and was quickly captured.
And he blamed the entire bizarre incident as well as the murder on both the concussion and SSRI withdrawal.
The detective said he also believed the doctor was a malingerer, or a faker of symptoms, and was preparing an insanity defense. Vince would contort his face, bob his head, gnaw his jaw, constantly moving his hands. He shuffled when he walked, got lost, stared about, confused and befuddled, pretending not to know what words meant.
And everyone thought it was all a bunch of bullshit, a ruse. So the police had the jail install cameras to watch him. And it appeared to them that the doctor only displayed these symptoms when a guard, lawyer, or police officer was nearby. In fact, Vince was even able to play basketball. And the kicker, for them at least, was that Vince said over the phone, and just listeners, by the way, any and all calls from a jail or prison are recorded and will be used against you. Well, Vince said on the phone that he was going to, quote, play the doctor card.
Chapter 3. The Letter.
Child of mine, I've a violent temper to lose. When I speak, I reek of booze.
So, Sarah from This American Life is there, digging for this story. It's no longer a silly 10-minute fluff piece on coincidences. It's now a serious investigation into murder, brain chemistry, and malingering. They need to make contact with Vince, talk to him, hear his side of the story. It was the only way forward.
So Sarah told Benjamin he was going to have to write to Vince. He had to do it. Make contact. But Benjamin was hesitant, frightened even. But eventually, he did it, saying in part in the letter,
Dear Dr. Gilmer, my name is Benjamin Gilmer, and I am currently one of the 2 practicing physicians at Cane Creek. It is likely that you didn't even know there was another Dr. Gilmer at Cane Creek. I know that it is very ironic. My first intention in writing to you is to share that your patients loved you. I have not encountered a patient that didn't cherish you as a physician. In many ways, I have inherited what you built at Cane Creek, and thank you for all of your work and the good care that you gave to the community. As a curious, compassionate person and physician, I have naturally wanted to figure out what happened to you leading up to the event. I was somewhat obsessed about understanding just what happened, and have heard a mosaic of patient stories about you. Recently, an NPR program, This American Life, asked me to tell the story about my experience walking in your footsteps. I thought that it might help me and the community to understand the truth in an effort to heal. If I didn't pursue knowing the truth, I would be haunted by the unknowing for the rest of my personal and professional life. If you allow me, I would like to come to the prison to meet you. Sincerely, Benjamin Gilmer, MD.
You ought to listen to your dear old dad when she's got the kids and a home. You're gonna wish that you had. Oh, you're gonna wish that you had.
For months, Benjamin awaited a reply, but there was nothing. He began to grow disheartened. His Thanksgiving turned toward the holiday season. And then, at the clinic's annual Christmas party, everyone was getting sauced, drinking margaritas, the party growing wild, and his receptionist came to him, saying, Dr. Gilmer. The other Dr. Gilmer wrote back, and handing him a letter.
The party grew silent, all eyes on Dr. Benjamin, as with trembling fingers he tore open the envelope. In it was a single sheet of paper with scrawled handwriting that read,
Dear Dr. Gilmer, I know who you are. I appreciated your letter, but you have stolen everything from me. Cane Creek is still mine. When I get out of this hellhole, I will be coming after you. I will find you, and you will pay.
Dr. Benjamin went into shock. It was too much, his worst fears. He panicked and darted out of the door, the room suddenly suffocating. He needed the cold, fresh air, his body shaking as he gasped outside, his wife running up to him.
When Deidre saw the letter, she exclaimed in horror, He can't get out, can he? Are we safe?
The couple timidly walked back into the party, shaken to their core, and the revelers looked at them and were like, "Surprise! It's a fake letter. We wrote it as a joke. Ha ha ha, good one."
It was all a drunken prank. Can you imagine? What the fuck, dude? And people think I have a fucked up sense of humor.
Yeah, that's wild. Oh, totally wild. Benjamin wished everybody Merry Christmas. As his wife said, "Some party," and they left.
Fucking hell, man. It's just too much. Oh, man. But then Benjamin received a real response from Vincent that in some ways was equally as terrifying.
The letter was scrawled in huge childlike letters, some of them backwards. It read,
"Aggression, violence uncontrollable, like this killing caused by my serotonin-deprived brain." And then the letters became so scrawled as to be indecipherable. It was a question of sorts, ending with, "It's insane. Please, please, help."
Chapter 4, Visit 1. Wallens Ridge was the infamous Supermax prison housing Dr. Vincent Gilmer that January of 2012, when audio journalist and podcaster Sarah Koenig and Dr. Benjamin Gilmer first visited. Vince was unrecognizable from the photos they'd seen. Bald, thin, his jumpsuit hanging off his body, unsteady on his feet, dazed, lost, old with sharp, sunken facial features, he shuffled along, appearing frail and confused. He looked like an 80-year-old man. He was only 50.
I'm Vince," he said. "What's the word?" But as he spoke, each word was a struggle, his mouth twitching, his lips curling.
They greeted each other, and Sarah soon asked him about the murders. And he said,
"I didn't want to kill my father. Voices were telling me to do it. Jellyfish stings, serotonin, torture."
By the time he was done, he was exhausted and slumped in his chair.
Benjamin asked if he wanted anything from the vending machines. He said he wanted 2 Cokes, 2 pizza pockets with pepperoni, 1 cheddar cheeseburger, and 4 Hostess snowballs. And he devoured it all, feasting on it like a starving person, swallowing whole, barely chewing. And as the sugar and calories hit, his tremors improved, and he became more intelligible. Vince explained his calories had been restricted. He wasn't getting the nutrition he needed, and he wasn't given the medication his body required, namely, more SSRI drugs. But, he said, sugar helped.
He said he could remember killing his father like a hazy dream, but doesn't know why he did it. But he was adamant that it wasn't planned. It just somehow happened, like it was someone else who had done it.
He said he wasn't allowed SSRI medication, which would help him, that guards mistreated him, and that prisoners had knocked out nearly all his teeth. He spent long periods in solitary isolation for disruptive behavior caused by his mental illness, which all the guards claimed he was faking. And in solitary isolation, the voices in his head just grew that much worse. And he constantly struggled just to find words to express himself.
Vince told them how he'd begun having seizures, during which he'd lose control of his bowels, and that guards, thinking he was faking it, as detectives claimed he was, would drag him out and beat him. And that after seizures, he could barely walk, talk, or remember anything. He says with no medication or psychiatry help, he just kept getting dumber and dumber.
Benjamin was struck by the lack of medical terminology the doctor used. He kept referencing his serotonin brain, whereas a doctor should have been saying serotonin discontinuation syndrome.
And Vince would say electrical shocks or jellyfish stings to describe the physical sensations, whereas paresthesias or dyskinesias would be the appropriate medical term.
Soon a guard was telling them it was time to leave, and Vince, gripping the table, stared pleadingly, saying, "Please, please, help me."
And that was it. Outside in the parking lot, Sarah turned to Benjamin and asked him if he thought Vince was faking it.
Dr. Benjamin Gilmer did not think he was faking it, saying he didn't think it was possible to fake all those many, many symptoms simultaneously.
Then Sarah, through a FISA records request, received the trial transcripts and began to study them.
The trial had taken place in Virginia, as that was where the body had been discovered, though it was never determined where the actual murder took place. Vince was originally examined by a Dr. Tony Sciarra, and oddly, that original diagnosis was gone and not in the record.
While Vince had excellent lawyers in North Carolina, they couldn't work in Virginia, and he had to find new legal representation. He did not like the new Virginia lawyers and was constantly arguing with them. He wanted to get the trial done with, saying it was obvious he'd been in psychosis through SSRI withdrawal, that any juror would believe it if he could just explain it to them.
But his new lawyers wanted to play it slow, drag it out, and find all kinds of expert witnesses to testify to how SSRI withdrawal worked.
Vince said they didn't need other doctors. He'd be the expert witness, and that he'd been in jail long enough as it was.
So Vince fired his Virginia lawyers, declaring himself an expert witness, despite not having qualifications in psychology, psychiatry, or neuroscience, telling the judge,
"I am an innocent man, and all I need to do is to tell the jury what happened."
The trial commenced and the prosecution came on strong, saying he was a lying, manipulative sociopath who'd killed his father to avoid the $200,000 medical bills and was now faking insanity.
And Vince then just completely dropped the ball, made a mockery of himself, and was just a bumbling idiot.
He literally knew nothing about the mechanics of how a trial even worked, which, if you think about it, is just another dangerously impulsive idea. He wasn't a lawyer, and he found himself constantly apologizing for his blundering, not understanding the proceedings, leading witnesses, saying at one point,
"I'm sorry, I'm just not a good questioner."
Vince grew even more disorganized and exhausted. He'd ask the judge for advice, then get lost. The judge saying to him at one point, "I don't know what you're asking me." And Vince replying back,
"I don't know either, Your Honor."
He was denied his motion to serve as his own expert witness and had no doctors to back up his claims about psychosis caused by SSRI withdrawal, which probably sounded like some kind of bizarre fantasy to the North Carolina jury.
While Vince tried to make himself an expert witness, the prosecution used Dr. Jeffrey Fisk, a psychologist who'd studied Dr. Gilmer in jail, who said he was completely sane and faking all of his symptoms.
Worse yet, even the scientific articles about SSRI withdrawal Vince tried to put into evidence were denied. Even though they were from medical journals like the Consultant Pharmacist and the American Journal of Pharmacology and the New England Journal of Medicine, he'd copied them from web article pages. Pages were missing, they were incomplete, not whole, cut and pasted off the internet. And since they weren't in their entirety, they weren't accepted as the esteemed medical journals that they were, and were not allowed as evidence.
Vince then dropped a huge bombshell. He claimed his father had molested him and his sister as a child, and that when he did, he would sing Ba Ba Black Sheep, and that on the night of the murder, his father had been humming the song which set something off, and the terrible voices, which he'd been long hearing, began demanding he kill his father.
Vince claimed his father had put a hole in the bathroom wall where he'd sit watching the family using the toilet. He said his father began to molest both Vince and his sister at very young ages. He'd actually forced Vince and his sister to have sex with each other and photographed it. And that this is why, at just 16, Vince had ran away from home, worked his way through college and went to medical school, all to escape the abuse. It's also why he refused to have children of his own. It was all a horrible, terrible secret he'd kept to himself, but his sister would verify all of it.
And his sister did verify it and was ready to testify. But on the day she was supposed to show up for the trial and testify, she suddenly went missing.
And she'd never be seen again. It's crazy. In his closing arguments, Vince said,
"I've been a terrible, terrible lawyer, but I was a good doctor. I really, really thought that if I were able to come in here and tell you all what happened, then you would understand."
And the prosecution described him as a, quote, deceitful, manipulative, selfish, and self-centered liar who is clearly without conscience and is capable of the atrocious crime of premeditated murder of his own father in a horribly cruel manner.
It only took the jury 45 minutes to find him guilty.
But right away, Sarah and Benjamin found holes in the prosecution's case. The prosecution claimed the murder was for financial gain, the huge hospital bill. But Vince was receiving checks for Social Security, which stopped after the death, meaning that technically he was now losing money by his father's death. And since his father was a veteran, the United States Army was actually responsible for and paying the hospital bills. Why hadn't Vince explained that the U.S. Army was going to pay the hospital bills? It was like he didn't understand how to refute the prosecution's claims, or just didn't even pay attention to them. The only real motive was revenge for the sexual abuse, which the prosecution claimed didn't happen. Though his sister did back up the claims and was willing to testify before she mysteriously disappeared.
And Vince never even mentioned the concussion and amnesia that had happened before the crime. If you were going to claim an insanity defense, surely you should bring up an extreme brain injury that left you with amnesia for days. He hadn't even tried to enter it into evidence. It was like he was lost, like he'd forgotten that it even happened. He began to ask the prosecution facts about the crime and openly ponder them as if he'd never heard them before.
Benjamin was struck by how many times Vince said sorry. Hundreds and hundreds of times in the trial transcripts, even apologizing to the prosecution. And Benjamin knew sociopaths did not apologize. Ted Bundy was his own defense, and he'd bungled it, but he'd never apologized.
Benjamin needed more answers. Sarah decided he needed to go back to the prison and see Vince again, study him medically, and this time bring along another medical doctor, someone specialized in neuroscience. So Benjamin brought a psychiatrist friend named Dr. Steve Bowie.
They placed the crown of thorns.
Chapter 5. The Second Visit. On the second visit, Vince seemed even worse. Again, he devoured the sugary food and soda, saying he'd come to the conclusion he needed at least 2,500 calories a day for normal brain function, and the prison was giving him a maximum of 1,500 and wouldn't let him have any medication at all.
Because of this, Vince had gone on a hunger strike and ended up in solitary confinement for a while. He looked terribly thin, wasting away.
The craving for sugar and calories interested the psychiatrist a great deal, especially when Vince said the voices in his head went away when he had enough to eat, or if he got any type of SSRI drug.
When they asked him about the night of the murder, he just stammered,
What's the word? What's the word? What's the word? What's the word? Don't remember everything. Voices, hearing voices. I was losing it.
When asked about his childhood, Vince stammered,
Dad molested me. Growing up was hell.
Dr. Steve Bowie asked if he'd ever had trouble with pets, hurt them, if he'd ever lit fires or gotten into fights. Vince, knowing these were signs of psychopathy, smiled and said,
I'm not crazy, Doc. At least not like that.
The psychiatrist noticed his peculiar gait, the shuffling way he walked, much like the movement of someone with Parkinson's, his facial tics, what he called jellyfish stings in his brain. He knew he wasn't faking. It was obvious to him.
When they got to the parking lot, the psychiatrist turned to Dr. Benjamin and said, But don't you think he has Huntington's?
Of course, Dr. Benjamin thought. Huntington's would explain everything.
Huntington's is an extremely rare and devastating neurological illness that manifests itself in the third or fourth decade of a patient's life, with symptoms resembling the worst of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease.
Depression, anxiety, irritability, paranoia, delusion, psychosis, cognitive impairment, executive functioning impairment, impulsivity, memory deficits, gait disturbance, weight loss, seizures. There is no cure. It slowly destroys the brain and results in death.
The disease was named after George Huntington, a physician who discovered the condition in several families in East Hampton, New York, in 1872. But the illness remained a mystery. It wasn't until 1983 that scientists were really able to study the disease after discovering two remote Venezuelan mountain villages where over 18,000 people showed symptoms.
And it wasn't until 1993 that molecular biologists were able to identify the precise gene that was mutated, the HTT gene.
The mutation of this gene causes a buildup of undigestible cellular debris inside the nerve cells of the brain, causing the basal ganglia to wither. Ugh, man. Talk about body horror. It's hardcore.
Yeah, it's been known to cause an increase in compulsive behavior such as gambling, sexual promiscuity, alcoholism, and drug addiction. Depression and anxiety are common. Social boundaries are erased, as is both short and long-term memory. Often, Huntington patients are misdiagnosed as schizophrenics, which, if you remember, is what happened to Vince's father.
Huntington's is an autosomal dominant genetic disease. If a parent carries the gene, each offspring has a 50-50 chance of inheriting the genetic mutation, meaning most likely Vince had inherited it from his father, who'd been misdiagnosed as a schizophrenic suffering early dementia.
They placed the crown of thorns on his head.
Benjamin and Dr. Buie came to the conclusion that the psychosis on the night of the murder was most likely a combination of brain injury, childhood PTSD from being molested, SSRI discontinuation syndrome, and early onset Huntington's disease.
All of these were like a perfect neurological storm of chaos that caused Dr. Vince's sudden psychosis and violence.
It's almost like shocking that he didn't do more crazy stuff with all that going on.
Right?
And Huntington's disease is fatal and without treatment would progress rapidly, meaning there was a catastrophically sick man in prison, but they would need a genetic test to know for sure.
And on March 28, 2013, lab work came back as Huntington Ally 1 plus 43 CAG repeats. Anything over 36 repeats or more was absolutely abnormal, and Vince was officially positive for Huntington's disease.
It was a time of strange elation. The mystery was solved. It explained everything, but it was also a death sentence. There was no cure. Most likely, Vince would slip into dementia and be dead within the next 5 to 10 years.
Vince had already spent almost 10 years in a maximum security prison, exhibiting symptoms that nobody believed were real, locked alone in a cell, and denied even the most basic of psychiatric medications.
Vince was finally transferred to a medical center for prisoners, the Marion Correctional Treatment Center, and was given 40 milligrams of citalopram, ironically the same drug he'd been requesting since the day of his arrest and denied. Feeling the mutation in his brain but not realizing what it was, the doctor had been medicating himself with SSRI drugs. Within days, his symptoms improved. He was given enough to eat, his tremors ceased, his thinking righted, and he became much more articulate. He laughed. He was like a completely different person, saying,
"My brain is getting better. After all these years of hell, having the DNA diagnosis that can't be argued with, it's a miracle all the way around, and it's going to work out for the best."
While his symptoms were slightly relieved through medication and nutrition, the truth was his brain was not getting better. There was no cure. He'd get worse and worse until he eventually died. But when Dr. Benjamin brought this up, saying, "I know the diagnosis is terrifying," Dr. Vince was lively enough to cut him off, no longer struggling for words, saying,
"I'm not terrified about it. To me, it was a relief."
Dr. Vince says he had known his whole life that he carried something that wasn't right. He was prone to impulsive actions and anxiety, but couldn't pinpoint why as it slowly grew worse and worse and worse and worse. And now he at last knew why, and knew why he had instinctively never wanted children, as he'd most likely pass this death sentence on to them.
But most importantly, now everyone could see that he wasn't a liar, a faker, a malingerer. Dr. Vincent Gilmer had been telling the truth the entire time.
I hung my head and cried. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray. You never know, dear, how much I love you. Please don't take my sunshine away. I told you once, dear, I'd always love
Chapter 6, On the Radio.
if you don't.
And then on April 12th, 2013, beaming out to NPR stations around the world, came This American Life, with the iconic and legendary Ira Glass introducing the episode, and, always loving a pun, talking about Dr. Gilmer and Mr. Hyde.
Did I mention how much I adore Ira Glass? I dream about this guy at night, huh?
I don't know if you have. I did not know that I knew this.
Oh yeah, man. I'm kind of maybe in love with him a little bit. I go to sleep every night with him talking in my ear. And the story, which had begun as a couple-minute fluff piece with a spooky edge, was now an entire hour-long episode. And Sarah Koenig went on to start a podcast about a controversial murder in Baltimore, Maryland. That podcast would be called Serial. After the This American Life episode, letters of support poured in, from those affected by Huntington's disease to those with mentally ill family in the prison system. There were also people offering assistance, such as a lawyer in Texas named Jennifer Bravoca, who came all the way to North Carolina to help them with the case.
Gloria, Vince's mother, called Dr. Benjamin, tearful and thankful, telling him he'd done a wonderful job telling her son's story. Gloria also solved another mystery, what happened to Vince's sister, who'd never shown up for trial to corroborate his story. She'd been in an abusive relationship. Her boyfriend had kidnapped her and beat her while she was on the phone with her mother begging for help. He'd broken her eye socket and several of her ribs. The FBI eventually found her, and her boyfriend was sent to prison. While there, his parents had died, leaving him millions. And when he got out, Vince's sister went missing and has never been seen again, most likely murdered.
It's fucking crazy, man. It was decided that they should pursue a writ of habeas corpus, Latin for show me the body. A writ of habeas corpus protects against unlawful imprisonment, forcing the state to give an imprisoned person a hearing at which the state has to provide reasons for continued incarceration. It makes no judgment about the defendant's guilt or innocence, like an appeal would, but just allows the prisoner to make a case for why their imprisonment is unlawful.
Much of the prosecution's case during the trial had been focused on accusing Vince of being a malingerer, of faking mental illness, while he kept insisting his brain wasn't working. But if he'd been diagnosed with Huntington's before the trial, those allegations wouldn't have stuck, making it an unfair trial. And he would never have been allowed to represent himself, much less try to make himself the expert witness.
And they wouldn't be fighting for Vince to be let out on the street, but for him to be moved from a prison to a mental hospital.
When they'd exhausted that process, then they'd have to go to the governor and appeal for clemency or a pardon.
And it was all going to be incredibly expensive, with countless hours of legal paperwork and proceedings, but a team was forming. Deirdre Enright, director of the UVA School of Law's Innocence Project Clinic, although the Innocence Project themselves couldn't get involved in the case because technically he was guilty.
And there was a new governor, Terry McAuliffe. He was a Democrat, and he'd be much more open to the idea of clemency for Vince than the previous governor, who'd been a Republican notorious for a tough-on-crime approach.
And so, the work to get Vince out of prison and into a hospital began.
Chapter 6. Family Visit. On Thanksgiving Day 2013, Dr. Gilmer was able to take his entire family, including his 2 young children, now ages 6 and 4, to Marion Prison to visit the other Dr. Gilmer.
The first visit Benjamin had made to the prison had been one of fear, terror even, interviewing a murderer. And the second visit had been one of hope. And now it was one of joy, as a family celebrating and giving thanks. What a crazy, crazy turnaround.
Just 18 months ago, Dr. Benjamin Gilmer had been terrified that this man would find out where he lived and kill him. Now he's bringing his children to the prison to be hugged by him.
Little Kai said the prison was like Willy Wonka's chocolate factory.
Vince struggled not to weep, wiping tears with a shaky hand and blinking as he hugged the family. They played Uno. Vince had gained weight, the medication was working wonders. He could speak well, the dark circles under his eyes and the hollowness were gone.
Story, man, it's such a fucking trip. So, CNN wanted to cover this story and make an episode about it. Benjamin was wary at first, but family agreed to an interview, hoping the press might help the cause.
Benjamin encouraged CNN to do a medical piece on the mystery of Huntington's disease, to visit Dr. Tony Lekchik, who ran the largest treatment center in the world for Huntington's patients, which was actually just a short walk away from the studio. There they could see how brilliant mathematicians and Shakespearean scholars sadly fell to the brain disease, and how the doctor worked tirelessly to comfort them.
Dr. Benjamin implored them to focus on the plight of the mentally ill in prison who received no treatment, the mystery and tragedy of mental disease. Instead, CNN did a 20-minute exploitation piece which questioned whether Vince was faking or not, even though it had been proven without a doubt that he had the crippling brain disease. And CNN ended the short segment with the original detective from the case calling Vince a liar and a fake.
That's kind of bullshit, because the real story is like, it seems like they just did that to be, scandalous and get viewers, but the real story is so much better than that. Anyhow, Dr. Benjamin felt totally betrayed.
And meanwhile, they waited for the new governor to make a ruling on clemency, while the former governor of Virginia, Bob McDonnell, was indicted on federal corruption charges, having accepted over $130,000 in bribes, and was sentenced to 2 years in prison. But the Supreme Court ended up overturning the former governor's conviction.
Benjamin couldn't help but be enraged that in just 2.5 years, the obviously guilty former governor, who was supposedly tough on crime, would be tried, convicted, and exonerated, while Vince had been rotting in prison for 13 years now.
Benjamin, using contacts with an old friend, wrote the state's attorney general and the governor's chief lawyer, and they all told him it was just a waiting game. So they waited and waited and waited, and then Governor McAlfee was leaving office and passing the petition on to the next governor, Dr. Ralph Northam, who was an actual neurologist.
The neurologist governor had to see that Vince was suffering from a devastating and deadly brain disease and should be in a hospital, not a prison.
But sadly, that would not be the case. The new governor denied clemency.
Worse yet was how it was denied. Usually, legal representation receives communication from the state so that they can confer with their client. But instead of informing Vince's attorneys who could break it to him, instead of telling Benjamin, who'd been fighting so hard on his behalf, They wrote a letter to Vince in prison. No explanation, no apologies, no hopeful words, just one line. Clemency is denied. And that was it.
When Benjamin heard, he raced to the prison to talk to Vince, surprised to find him calmly resigned and stoic about a life in prison.
Benjamin tried to tell him that there was still hope. They could somehow still get him out, that justice was on their side. Vince smiled and said,
"Please don't be sad. It's okay. You came over the mountain. You believed in me. That was a gift I never thought I'd get. You helped me to understand myself, even though it wasn't what I hoped to find. Even if I never get out of here, I have a new friend, a brother. I know you did everything you could."
Vince offered Dr. Benjamin a hug, something he was famous for, and wrapped him in his bear-like embrace. And oddly, it wasn't the Dr. Gilmer with the fatal brain disease locked away in a cell that wept. It was Benjamin who cried like a baby as Vince soothed him and patted his back, like he'd done with his patients all those years ago when he'd started the family health center with his wife.
They'd have to wait 2 years before they could submit another clemency petition. So Benjamin wrote a book about the bizarre and deeply tragic story called The Other Dr. Gilmer, which is what we are using as our main source.
Benjamin specifically wanted to write something that directly countered the sensationalist CNN true crime special that focused on the brutality of the crime and speculated that Vince was faking his symptoms.
Yeah, and just a side note here, I want to say that obviously Murder Coaster doesn't hide the sensationalist side of true crime. We don't deny that true crime is part thrill ride and part freak show. That all true crime is a freak show in one way or another. We don't pretend to be highbrow journalism, yet we do deep and diligent research. And we offer a multifaceted approach, and if possible, always explore the plight of humanity. Pretty much the opposite of CNN and all the other mainstream news, pretending to not be a freak show, pretending that, oh, they have integrity and are journalists, yet ignoring the aspects that would make them legitimate in that regard. Here, we don't sugarcoat the freak show aspects. We actually celebrate them, but we also do so with integrity and thorough research.
And in writing his book, Benjamin also wanted something he could hand to the governor, a physical representation of Vince's story that could be held and touched. The real story, not an hour-long This American Life piece, as nuanced and deep as it was, not a 20-minute true crime shocker from CNN. Something beyond a story of murder and coincidence. Benjamin wanted to write a medical mystery, a legal thriller, tale of crime and punishment, a look at society and justice and their misconceptions, a, quote, heartbreaking saga of intergenerational abuse and how a disease ravaged a family, end quote.
And in writing his book, Benjamin would interview more Huntington's experts, enlist the help of more neurologists. He'd consult with Brian Stevenson, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, and many more. He even consulted with Dr. Jeffrey Fisk, the forensic psychologist who testified at the trial that Vince was faking his symptoms and was a liar.
Dr. Jeffrey Fisk humbly agreed with Vince, saying if he'd known that he did in fact have Huntington's, he obviously wouldn't have called him a malingerer. It was just such a rare and bizarre disease, no one could have known.
Dr. Fisk said that had Vince been diagnosed before the trial, he would have been evaluated by an actual neurologist and a psychiatrist, not just a court-ordered psychologist. Dr. Fisk also thought the outcome of the trial would have been different.
Then Benjamin just asked Dr. Fisk straight up, to his face, should Vincent Gilmer be in prison?
And the psychologist who testified at the trial that Vince was a liar and a killer answered without hesitation, no, The mentally ill should not be locked up. He should be in a treatment facility. If I had known then that he had Huntington's, that's where he'd be.
Benjamin went to Vince in prison to tell him of his plans for a book. The disease was steadily taking its toll on Vince. He had difficulty forming words, communicating. The tics were worse. Benjamin asked him, "What do you want this book to say?"
Vince replied haltingly, "Prison is torture. Sex abuse changes you forever. We are all at the mercy of our brains. Listening is healing."
In April 2019, a second petition for clemency was submitted to Governor Northam. Benjamin wrote the governor letters, personally delivered by Senator Cree Deeds. He talked to the governor's Secretary of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. He contacted parole board members, all to no avail. Clemency was rejected yet again.
Vince's speech grew worse, his cognition slowing down. He was barely able to walk, beginning to be unable to swallow.
Then the book came out, was talked about wide and far. In it, Benjamin states in part, quote, "I am a doctor and I have taken an oath to do no harm. More importantly, I am a human and I believe that we must be responsible for one another, our fellow humans. Even if we do not free Vince, I will continue to honor him as someone who healed thousands during his career as a doctor. His life should not be defined by one moment of profound mental illness. He is a human who deserves dignity. There are so many other Dr. Gilmers out there in the world. They need our compassion, but most of all, they need our help."
And apparently, the book must have had some impact, for the governor stated he was reconsidering his decision. He just wanted to be sure that Vince had the proper guardianship. And Benjamin was, of course, more than ready to take on the role of guardian.
Clemency was granted. For a moment, it was a time of celebration, but things moved at a snail's pace. The Commonwealth of Virginia refused to collaborate on transferring him to a state mental hospital, even though there was one a few hundred feet away from the prison that actually shared a parking lot. Weeks passed, then months. Vince was getting worse. He could now no longer walk, was in a wheelchair, and was now in administrative hold, which is really no different from solitary confinement.
Benjamin petitioned every public mental hospital in the state of Virginia to take Vince as a patient. But without support from the Virginia Department of Mental Health, they all refused. Bureaucracy was now Vince's prison. In a bizarre catch-22, any hospital that would accept him stated he needed to be first put in another Virginia hospital for a state-to-state transfer.
A private hospital seemed their only hope, but they all had extremely long wait lists, some up to 3 years. Plus, they cost upwards of $45,000 a month.
Then the lead psychiatrist at Mission Hospital in Asheville read Benjamin's book and came to Benjamin asking how she could help. And in November, Mission Hospital officially decided to take Vince.
It had been a year since he'd been granted clemency, and 19 years of incarceration.
And today, Dr. Vince Gilmer is being treated in the Mission Hospital as a transitional step to a long-term care facility. Though how long he has to live is unknown. He's already far outlived the life expectancy of one with Huntington's disease.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the curious case of the two Dr. Gilmers. We hope you enjoyed it.
What do you think? Are we like This American Life, or am I just dreaming?
I mean, we can dream. I'm right there with you. Like I said, let's let our listeners weigh in on that.
Next question. Is it spooky time yet? Is it spooky season, you think?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, we were talking before we went on air of the chill in the air. There's a jack-o'-lantern candle in my bathroom. That's just... So I was at Necronomicon this past weekend, and I brought a bunch of Halloween decorations out for the We Are Providence table there. And so when I unpacked them from my car, I was like, I'm not putting these back in the bins and they're ready. They're ready to come up into the house.
Yes.
Yep, the tombstones, the skull, black flower arrangements, they're all ready.
Hell yeah, I have got 2 super spooky episodes coming. Very
Sweet.
excited. Demonic possession and sacrifice to the devil. So stay tuned, everybody, because next week we are going to get super spooky. And hey, you want to reach out to us, got a case we think we should cover, or do we get something wrong? You want to give us some cool information? You just want to say hi, tell us about yourself? Please do so. Contact us at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. That's murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. And as you heard from Krista, it is officially spooky season. Let's get spooky.
Woo!